各位觀眾大家好，歡迎收睇26分鐘見證實錄。喺加國有超過620萬嘅加拿大人面對某種形式嘅殘障，而且呢一個數字仍在增長之中。為咗令到殘障以及有唔同需要嘅人士能夠充分咁融入社區、投入生活，社會各界都積極推動建造無障礙環境。而每年從5月嘅最後一個星期日開始嘅1年7日啦，就被定為係全國無障礙週。為咗配合今年嘅全國無障礙週，喺今集嘅節目，我哋就分別請嚟咗2名知名嘅無障礙倡導者進行專訪，分享佢哋多年嚟推動無障礙環境嘅歷程。佢哋分別係前溫哥華市長蘇利文 Sam Sullivan， 以及喺30多年前就完成咗用輪椅橫越世界34個國家，以提高社會對殘障人士關注嘅 Rick Hansen。Mr. Rick Hansen 你好啊，首先多謝你接受我哋嘅訪問啊。
Yes, thanks a lot. It's wonderful to be here.
咁從1985年開始，你嘅 Man in Motion 輪椅橫越世界旅程至今已經係超過35年啦。回望過去啊，呢一個旅程嘅背後，其實靈感係乜嘢呢？又係啲乜嘢令到你踏上咁艱巨同挑戰性嘅旅程呢？
Well, I was injured when I was 15 years old, back in 1973, almost 50 years ago. And at that time, people's attitudes about people with disabilities were pretty limited, mostly a sense of pity, inaccessibility, lack of opportunity. And I inherited that stigma when I was 15, when I had my accident. So my biggest battle was in my internal awareness and attitude about potential and opportunity, shifting from negative to positive. And as I became an athlete and traveled the world, I saw that other people had those attitudes towards me and my colleagues. And also there were physical barriers everywhere. And so after a number of years where I had been able to accommodate to my disability, to feel optimistic and show ability, I felt grateful for all of the support that I had received and thought that I could pay it forward and try to make a difference by doing something that was using my talent at the time as a world champion, an Olympic medalist gold medalist in Paralympic marathoning, and be able to then travel around the world in an ultra marathon of social change, the Man in Motion World Tour, and show what was possible if people with disabilities had barriers removed. And the challenge at that time was to create awareness of the potential of people with disabilities, raise funds for accessibility, and also help drive support for a cure for paralysis one day, so that the next generation may not ever have to have a spinal cord injury. They could actually have full recovery. So that was my motivation, as coming through the experience of living with a spinal cord injury, dealing with disability, and then seeing the barriers that were inside society, mentally, socially, and try to make a difference.
咁旅程之中啊，有邊啲最難忘嘅時刻或者係地點，令你今時今日依然係印象好深刻㗎？
The very first day, being able to start the Man in Motion Tour was one of the greatest challenges and successes, although I didn't do a lot to instill optimism in the 200 well-wishers who came to support me, because as I wheeled through the parking lot underneath a tunnel, my friends who were driving the motorhome, my team, they hit an overheight warning bar and they crashed boxes off the tunnel. And that moment was really symbolic for me. The second highlight for me that represents the dream in motion is that when we were in the country of China, it was such an incredible highlight for me to know that China had opened its doors. And little did I know that a decade earlier, because of the friendship between Deng Xiaoping and Pierre Elliott Trudeau, our Prime Minister in Canada, that they had been friends, and ultimately Deng Xiaoping was the son of Deng Xiaoping, and he had a spinal cord injury, and he came to Canada for life-saving medical support, and he was inspired by social justice in Canada, spinal cord research, and he went back home and with a mission to make a difference. And so China opened its doors and were incredibly gracious, and the response in China was overwhelming. I was moved and inspired, and ultimately one of the greatest symbols in China was to be able to wheel up the Great Wall to one of the highest places, and having that as a symbol that there are no barriers, no walls too big that can't be climbed, is always indelibly marked in my soul, and it inspires me today.
咁自從嗰次嘅旅程以嚟啊，呢30多年間，無障礙概念咧喺我哋嘅社會之中發生咗啲乜嘢嘅變化同演變呢？
There was a stigma. As we moved through the decades, it started to become considered a human right. And little did I know at that time, the United States of America was advocating for an Americans with Disabilities Act, which would be a legislation that would fundamentally change opportunities for people with disabilities. And Canada has followed suit finally. I know China has followed suit since my Man in Motion World Tour with human rights. The UN Convention on Rights and Freedoms of People with Disabilities has been embedded. So countries around the world are now seeing the social justice part of including people with disabilities as a fundamental right in society. But we're also starting to see, with the advent of technology and new opportunities, the economic and cultural imperative that people with disabilities actually are able to drive an economy, be employees in meaningful ways, be able to contribute with their resiliency and the diversity of their perspective.
咁你認為啊，現今殘障人士喺無障礙方面面臨一啲乜嘢重大嘅挑戰啊？
People are still stunned when we tell them that there are over 1.3 billion people on the planet today, according to the World Health Organization, living with a disability. They go, oh my gosh, I had no idea there were so many people. And I believe that's often because disability is fragmented into categories of, are you have a spinal cord injury or a brain injury or Parkinson's disease or arthritis, or are you visual or hearing challenged, or what is the disability? And so it becomes very fragmented. And often our society only sees the symbol of a wheelchair, a stick man in a wheelchair, as the symbol of accessibility. So I think trying to make people understand this is a big deal, and aging baby boomers will also accelerate that number exponentially. Attitudes are getting better, but physical infrastructure and employment opportunities, social welfare supports are still very challenged. Disability is still the #1 issue in human rights lawsuits in Canada.
咁你可唔可以解釋一下要建設無障礙社會咁喺各方面嘅重要性呢？
You know, the places and spaces that people live, work, learn, and play must be accessible and inclusive to allow people to not only gain access to those opportunities, but to fully participate and contribute. And that's the challenge that we see today. When we look at unemployment figures, they're totally unacceptable. They really represent some of the biggest challenges today. We have over 500,000 people in Canada ready to work if workplaces were accessible to them. And the economic impacts of that are massive. If we were able to become more accessible between now and 2030, we would see probably an understanding that we have $340 billion of consumer spending available. We would have close to $14 billion of tax revenue, and these are huge benefits that come to society if we actually make economies accessible.
你可唔可以分享一下你近年嚟睇到嘅一啲改善無障礙環境嘅創新方案嘅一啲例子啊？
Our foundation, as an example, has realized that while there are many issues to deal with on disability, that if we tackle the built environment, the places and spaces we live, work, learn, and play, we can actually make those completely accessible. But the big challenge is that there are so many pieces of legislation and that not everyone in the industry of construction and development and design has the competency and the knowledge to make their buildings fully accessible from a universal and inclusive design perspective. And so we decided to bring a world-class expert in accessible design, supported by a world-class curriculum and have that curriculum be available to teach architects, engineers, city planners, developers, and advocates for the disabled so that they would all be speaking the same language of universal and inclusive design and also measuring the same things so we can actually build universal and inclusive design effectively. And then supporting that training program is a rating and certification initiative. And the idea is to rate buildings so that you could actually determine whether a building is not accessible, accessible, or accessibility certified gold. And then those metrics could be available everywhere.
咁你認為啊，高科技同埋創新將可以點樣推動未來無障礙嘅工作呢？
Technology is one of the greatest enabling opportunities for people with disabilities on the planet today. It's unbelievable, and we saw that during COVID. I mean, COVID obviously forced everyone to be able to reach out virtually, and people with disabilities were able to work remotely, without having to deal with the incredible challenges of getting up 2 hours in the morning earlier than the average person just to get out the door, then the challenges of a commute and getting transportation, and then getting back again. They were able to do that right from their home effectively and utilize technology to maximize their ability. And that's really awesome. Technology is also becoming more responsive to new needs of a very diverse group of people with disabilities, from visual, hearing, mobility, and even from neurodiversity perspective and cognitive challenges. So I really do believe that we're going to see phenomenal opportunities for the future as technology converges to be applying to help people with disabilities have better function and more independence.
我知道啊，喺 Rick Hansen 基金會啦，有好多唔同嘅項目啦、資助同埋研究項目正在進行之中㗎。你可唔可以咧分享幾個你認為係最成功咁改變到大家生活嘅例子啊？
On the spinal cord research side, which is where we spent a lot of time in the first few decades, and one in Vancouver was the need for a global spinal cord research center, like a hub. And so we brought the Government of Canada, Government of British Columbia, private investment from the Blessons, and they created a $55 million state-of-the-art spinal cord research center right at the hospital site where spinal cord patients are, and bring researchers, clinicians, and people with spinal cord injury together. And that was a really important first step to put spinal cord research and care as a top priority. The second part of that, though, was we wanted that to be a hub of a national and global network. And so we created an institute that was designed to bring collaborators together from around the world, including China, and be able to share knowledge, collaborate together, and accelerate the progress. Spinal cord research and a cure for paralysis is such a big problem. There's only one way we'll solve it, is to be able to unite the world to work in a global way, to be able to put the best of our thinking and our resources into play and then demonstrate that either works, and if it does, then we can actually translate that into action.
咁你已經完成過一次環遊世界旅程啦，亦已經建立咗一個基金會，你都喺促進同埋教育無障礙方面咧做咗好多工作。咁你嘅下一步係乜嘢啊？你下一個項目又係乜嘢咧？
From our perspective, the goal is to take our certification program, to move it from being a pilot and a startup here in Canada to being a global force for change, a global standard that has over 250,000 accredited professionals, all in the design community, and normalizing the accessibility in the built environment, and knowing that we'll look back in 10 years' time and what people will wonder, what was the big problem and dealing with the buildings? Doesn't everybody know that they're all built totally accessible? That's the vision that we want to see in the next 10 years, and I'm super excited about that.
Mr. Rick Hansen， 今日再次多謝你接受我哋嘅訪問啦。
Thank you. It's an honor. Appreciate it.
Rick Hansen 以及佢嘅基金會多年嘅工作，令到社會上眾多有唔同需要嘅人士受惠。咁喺下一節翻嚟啊，我哋就專訪另一位喺推廣無障礙環境工作上非常有代表性嘅人物——前溫哥華市長蘇利文。好，翻嚟節目時間。Sam Sullivan 蘇利文曾經係溫哥華市議員，其後更加成為溫市市長，亦都當選過為卑詩省議員。咁佢本身係一名殘障人士， 而佢嘅工作、努力及身份，就更加將溫哥華無障礙城市嘅形象帶到國際舞台。Mr. Sullivan， 首先多謝你啦，今日接受我哋嘅訪問啊。
Thanks for having me.
首先咧，你可唔可以同我哋分享一下你自己嘅經歷係點樣促使你咧成為推廣無障礙嘅倡導者，咁並且繼而從政添啊？
Well, when I was injured in a skiing accident and I broke my neck and I lost the use of my fingers and legs and some of my arm muscles, like I can't lift my arm above my head, that made me quite aware of all the problems. And so I started to develop programs for disabled people, and we're always running into difficulties with the city, you know. So I thought, okay, well, I should get more involved, and I did, and volunteered in politics, and then ended up being running a candidate, and then being a city councillor.
咁回顧過去啦，你擔任市議員、溫哥華市長同埋省議員期間，有冇推動咗邊一啲嘅措施或者係政策嚟到促進市內嘅無障礙環境啊？
Well, I have to be very honest about this in that I sometimes I say to people, Vancouver is so accessible not because we had a disabled mayor. We had a disabled mayor because it was so accessible. So there was many people that went before me and made it so accessible. There was decades and decades of hardworking people, just citizens, trying to get the city council to make some changes. And so I came along, and lots of it was done, and we just had to keep doing more of it. So I think maybe 50% of all the roads had curb ramps, the corners, and very few buses were accessible. So we just really pushed more effort on that and started and more like completed the good work that other people started. Fortunately, I had a good narrative because the Paralympics and the Olympics were coming and the world was going to be watching. I said, we better do this right, you know, so that helped to make the sale, and people said, oh yeah, we better do this, you know.
咁講到奧運啊，喺2006年都靈奧運會嘅閉幕儀式上啊，你從輪椅上揮舞住奧林匹克嘅旗幟嘅時候，嗰一刻咧引起咗全世界嘅關注啊！你認為呢一個舉動點樣有助於促進世界以及世界體育界對無障礙嘅睇法呢？
Yeah, well, I think I certainly got a lot of attention internationally, and they say, oh, disabled person can become mayor, you know, what's that about? So they saw, you know, that a city like Vancouver that is very inclusive and very involving and embracing of others, if you do that, then everybody can participate, and everybody's better off when everybody can be part of the society.
咁你嗰次之後啊，係咪收到好多嘅迴響啊？
Yeah, I did. I received all sorts of letters and emails and, you know, all sorts of people coming to Vancouver, and you know, so, and then that helped to advertise the city as a very progressive city.
咁溫哥華市啊，被公認咧係無障礙工作上嘅領導者嚟㗎。你認為令到溫市成功嘅關鍵因素係乜嘢咧？咁同埋啊，其他嘅城市可以從溫哥華嘅做法之中吸取邊一啲嘅經驗啊？
Vancouver has a really important accessibility committee. And actually, before I got involved in the city, the government, I went around the province and set up about 30 that were modeled on Vancouver's. So I always found that was very helpful to have that committee, and the people on the committee often would recommend really good things, and, you know, because they're seeing it from the inside. So, but it really also is important to have strong advocacy groups. So, you know, we had a lot of little groups that were very committed to accessibility. And we were lucky to have that. Because if you have all the best laws in the world, but nobody advocating, it really won't happen.
從你嘅觀察啦，近年嚟我哋喺無障礙工作方面取得咗啲乜嘢嘅進展啊？你認為有邊啲方面咧係需要更多嘅關注同改進呢？
One of the problems when you look around here, every fifth or sixth or 10th building has a little tiny stair, you know, and the city has just said that's up to them, it's private property, and you know, we want them to do it. And I think we have to be a little bit more assertive and a little bit more helpful, you know. So there's so many great solutions that I found when I go around the world, and it needs some leadership, you know, and maybe a little bit of funding, not much, you know. It's just such a small barrier that makes huge difference. Yeah, so I think that's a really important thing.
你覺得政府同埋地方當局啊，喺為所有民眾創造無障礙環境方面啦，應該發揮乜嘢作用啦？佢哋可以點樣同個人或者係組織合作，以實現呢一個目標啊？
Yes, you do need government, but you need citizens who are active and organizations who make it a priority for them to make sure that we have the most accessibility possible. But I must say, Vancouver is like paradise. You know, when I go around the world, even across the country, it's shocking, you know, how, in the US, you know, the US has this Disability Act, and everybody thinks, oh, I wish we could have one. None of those cities are more accessible than Vancouver. And Vancouver really didn't have that for most of the time. So, you know, I think it's really important. Citizens have to take responsibility.
你認為啊，我哋嘅社會喺邊方面仍然需要努力先至能夠真正做到無障礙呢？
There's always, you know, the kind of the prejudices of people. They just sort of assume if you're disabled, maybe you don't have what it takes to do things. So, but that's actually up to the disabled people to. So I don't believe we have to have everybody doing everything for us. You know, we have to. What I found is when you try to do something and people see that, they like it and they want to be part of the team and they will help you. But, you know, sometimes government messes things up, like with the welfare system. You know, it can be it used to be if you were on welfare and then you made any money, you had to give it to the government, you know. So it was really not, there was no incentive. In fact, there was disincentive to work because, you know, you'd actually, it cost money to go to work, and yet you have to give all your money back, you know. So that's being changed a lot. But still, there's concerns about people who are worried what will happen to their only support.
咁對於嗰啲啊，希望喺未來進一步咁促進無障礙環境嘅年輕一代，你有啲乜嘅建議俾佢哋啊？
You know, it's so important, like I say, the citizens themselves. And, you know, I've got so much out of people who just ask me, maybe my neighbors, you know, what is it that I can help you with? And, you know, can I make your life, how can I help, you know? And that's all you need to ask.
Mr. Sullivan， 今日再次多謝你接受我哋嘅訪問啊！
Thank you very much for your interest.
好啦，今集嘅節目時間呢又差唔多啦。咁喺下一集嘅節目，我哋就會去睇睇我哋喺城市建設方面無障礙嘅工作做得如何。如果觀眾對我哋今集嘅節目有啲乜嘢意見嘅話，係好歡迎大家以電郵嘅方式同我哋聯絡㗎。我哋嘅電郵地址係 nag26@fairchildtv.com。如果觀眾想上網重溫翻今集嘅節目，亦都可以上到去我哋嘅網站3w.fairchildtv.com， 點擊節目重溫一欄就可以睇得翻㗎啦。下星期同樣時間再同大家見面，晚安。